They descended into the darkness knowing they would not return. 6 Italian divers, suspended beneath the black Mediterranean waters, riding steel torpedoes toward the heart of the British Empire's naval might. In less than 6 hours, 2 of the most powerful warships on Earth would be crippled. The men who did it would be captured, interrogated, and imprisoned. And yet, on the night of December 18, 1941, as their submarine surfaced in hostile waters off the Egyptian coast, not one of them hesitated. This is the story of how 6 men in rubber suits and breathing apparatus rewrote the balance of naval power in World War II, and how their desperate, suicidal mission became one of the most audacious special operations in military history. The submarine Scirè cut through the Mediterranean like a blade through silk. Her hull, painted the color of deep water, moved without sound through the moonless night. Inside her cramped pressure hull, the air tasted of diesel fuel, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear that no man would acknowledge. Commander Junio Valerio Borghi stood in the control room, his face illuminated only by the faint red glow of instrument panels. He had brought his vessel to within 1.5 miles of Alexandria harbor, close enough to see the distant glow of the city against the desert sky, close enough that any British patrol boat or aircraft could end everything in seconds. Below, in the forward compartment, 6 men prepared themselves for what might be their final hours. They wore black rubber diving suits that clung to their skin like a second layer of flesh. The suits were heavy, uncomfortable, restrictive. Breathing through the oxygen rebreathers required constant attention, a rhythm that had to be maintained or else carbon dioxide would build up and turn the blood to acid, the mind to confusion, the body to a convulsing wreck. Each man checked his equipment with the practiced movements of countless training divees, but tonight the training was over. Tonight, every mistake would be measured in tons of seawater crushing down, or bullets tearing through vulnerable flesh, or drowning in the darkness with lungs screaming for air that would never come. Lieutenant Luigi Durand de la Penne ran his hands over the controls of his human torpedo one final time. The Italians called these machines maiali, pigs, because they were stubborn, difficult, prone to mechanical failure at the worst possible moments. The torpedo was 22 feet of steel cylinder powered by an electric motor, topped with a detachable warhead containing 660 pounds of high explosive. 2 men would ride it like a motorcycle underwater, the pilot lying prone at the front, his second lying behind him, both guiding the machine through pitch-black waters by compass and intuition alone. De la Penne was a career officer, a man who had chosen the elite diving unit because he believed in precision, in training, in the cold mathematics of warfare. His partner, Chief Diver Emilio Bianchi, was the opposite, a working-class seaman who had learned to dive because it paid better, who trusted his instincts more than any compass, who believed that luck mattered more than planning. Together, they would target the largest warship in Alexandria harbor. Beside them, Captain Antonio Marceglia and Corporal Spartaco Scirè prepared their own torpedo. Marceglia was a quiet man, analytical, the kind of officer who read engineering manuals for pleasure and could recite the armor thickness of every British battleship from memory. Scirè was his opposite, loud, jovial, a man who made jokes to cover his nervousness and who had once confessed during training that he did not know how to swim before joining the diving unit. Their target would be the second battleship in the harbor, whichever presented the best opportunity. They did not speak much as they checked their equipment. There was nothing left to say. The third team consisted of Captain Vincenzo Martellotta and Sergeant Mario Marino. Martellotta was the oldest of the 6, a veteran of earlier raids, a man whose hands no longer trembled before missions because he had used up his capacity for fear years ago. Marino was young, barely 22, with a face that still looked boyish despite months of brutal training. He had volunteered for the diving unit after watching his older brother die in a naval engagement off Calabria. He never explained why this made him want to join the most dangerous unit in the Italian Navy. Perhaps he did not know himself. Their target would be whatever else they could find. A tanker, a destroyer, anything that would burn and sink and weaken the British stranglehold on the Mediterranean. At 2300 hours, Commander Borghese gave the order. The Sire's deck crew unsealed the cylindrical containers welded to the submarine's hull, each one containing a human torpedo. Seawater flooded the containers as they opened, cold and black and infinite. The 6 divers slipped into the water one by one, each man feeling the sudden shock of immersion, the weight of the sea pressing against the rubber suit, the hiss of the rebreather as it fed oxygen into hungry lungs. They mounted their torpedoes in the darkness, hands finding the controls through touch alone, and then they were moving, 3 machines gliding away from the Sire like mechanical sharks, propellers spinning silently, heading toward the distant glow of Alexandria. The harbor entrance was a mile away. It might as well have been 1,000. Between the divers and their targets lay minefields, patrol boats, listening posts equipped with hydrophones that could detect the faint electric hum of their motors, anti-submarine nets strong enough to stop a torpedo and certainly strong enough to trap a man. The British had turned Alexandria into a fortress, the primary base for the Mediterranean fleet, home to battleships and cruisers and aircraft carriers worth more than entire cities. Hundreds of sailors stood watch on dozens of ships. Searchlights swept the water at irregular intervals. Guard boats motored back and forth along the harbor mouth. The British knew that the Italians had human torpedoes. They had captured one during an earlier raid. They knew an attack was possible, even likely. They were waiting. De la Penne lay flat on his torpedo, feeling the vibration of the motor through his body, watching the compass needle swing slowly in its housing. Beside him, he could sense more than C. Bianch's presence. The other man's breathing transmitted through the water as a series of bubbles that rose and vanished in the darkness above. They moved at walking speed, slow enough to minimize noise, slow enough that the harbor entrance seemed to recede rather than approach. Time became elastic, unmeasurable. Minutes felt like hours. De la Penne's hands ached from gripping the controls. His jaw hurt from clenching the mouthpiece of his rebreather. Salt water had leaked into his mask and stung his eyes, but he could not risk surfacing to clear it. He navigated by counting his own heartbeats, by feeling the current push against the torpedo's hull, by trusting that the training had been enough. At midnight, the British destroyers guarding the harbor entrance began their scheduled maneuver. The massive anti-submarine net that blocked the harbor mouth, a steel curtain hanging from buoys to the seabed, was designed to be opened for friendly ships entering or leaving port. Tonight, 3 British destroyers were returning from patrol. The officer of the watch gave the order, and the net began to rise, hauled up by winches and pulleys, creating a gap just wide enough for the destroyers to pass through in single file. The operation took 12 minutes. The Italians had known about this schedule for weeks. Intelligence gathered from a spy network that stretched from Cairo to Rome, from port workers who noted ship movements to clerks who filed routine reports without understanding their significance. De la Penne saw the shadow of the first destroyer pass overhead, a dark shape against the slightly less dark water, the sound of its propellers a distant thunder that made his teeth vibrate. He waited, counting seconds, feeling the current change as the massive hull displaced thousands of tons of water. Then he pushed the throttle forward, and the torpedo surged ahead, slipping through the gap in the net just as the 3rd destroyer entered the harbor. For a moment, the Italian machine was directly beneath the British warship, close enough that de la Penne could have reached up and touched the barnacle-encrusted hull. Then they were through, inside Alexandria harbor, surrounded by the enemy, committed beyond any possibility of retreat. The other two teams followed. Marceglia and Scirè came next, their torpedo nearly colliding with the descending net as it began to close behind the destroyers. Scirè later claimed he felt the steel mesh brush against his back, though in the darkness it was impossible to know if this was real or imagination. Martellotta and Marino were last, and they were not as fortunate. Their torpedo's motor began to emit a high-pitched whine as they approached the net, a mechanical scream that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Martellotta immediately cut the power, and the machine began to sink, its positive buoyancy lost, falling toward the muddy bottom 50 feet below. They managed to restart the motor at the last second and limp through the gap just as the net sealed shut behind them. They were inside, but their torpedo was damaged, unreliable, a machine that might fail at any moment. Inside the harbor, the world changed. The water was murky, polluted with oil and sewage and the detritus of a naval base that housed thousands of men and hundreds of ships. Visibility, already nearly zero in the open sea, became absolute darkness. The divers navigated by compass alone, following planned routes memorized during months of preparation, adjusting for currents they could feel but not see. Above them, the surface was a ceiling of reflected light, the glow of Alexandria's street lamps and the anchor lights of warships creating a dim, distorted illumination that penetrated only a few feet into the depths. Below them, the bottom was invisible, known only through depth gauges that had to be read by touch because no light could reach them. De la Penne and Bianchi moved deeper into the harbor, following a compass bearing that should take them to the capital ships. British battleships did not anchor near the harbor entrance where they would be vulnerable to conventional torpedo attack. They sat in the inner harbor, protected by layers of defense, patrol boats, anti-torpedo nets that surrounded each ship individually, guard posts on nearby piers, searchlight operators who swept the water constantly. The two Italians crept forward at a depth of 15 feet, deep enough to avoid being silhouetted against the surface, but shallow enough to avoid underwater obstacles. Their oxygen was already running low, the rebreathers' chemical scrubbers absorbing carbon dioxide less efficiently as they became saturated. Each man could feel the first symptoms of oxygen deprivation: a slight headache, a tingling in the fingers, a dreamlike quality to their perceptions that made it hard to distinguish memory from reality. After nearly an hour of blind navigation, de la Penne saw it, a shadow too large to be anything except a battleship. The hull rose from the darkness like a cliff face, barnacles and rust and rivets creating a landscape of industrial architecture that stretched further than he could see in any direction. He checked his compass, verified his position, and felt a surge of something between triumph and terror. This was HMS Queen Elizabeth, 33,000 tons of steel and guns, flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet, one of the most powerful warships ever built, and he was going to sink her. The plan was simple in concept, agonizing in execution. The human torpedo would be driven beneath the battleship's keel, positioned at the precise point where the hull was most vulnerable. Then the warhead would be detached, lowered to the muddy bottom directly beneath the ship, and armed with a timer set for several hours. The explosion would occur not against the ship's armored sides but beneath her, where the hull plating was thinnest, where the force of the blast would be magnified by the water itself, creating a hammer blow that would crush bulkheads and rupture fuel tanks and flood compartments faster than any damage control team could respond. If everything worked perfectly, the battleship would sink at her moorings, settling into the mud of Alexandria harbor, out of action for months or years or forever. But nothing worked perfectly. De la Penne guided the torpedo beneath the Queen Elizabeth's hull and immediately encountered the anti-torpedo net that surrounded the ship. The net hung like a curtain, impossible to see in the darkness, detectable only when the torpedo's nose struck it and the entire machine shuddered to a halt. De la Penne reversed the motor, backed away, tried to find a gap or a weakness. There was none. The net extended from the surface to the bottom, a complete barrier. He checked his watch, a luminous dial that glowed faintly in the absolute darkness. They had been underwater for 90 minutes. Oxygen was critical. Time was running out. He made a decision that violated every safety protocol. He would go over the net rather than under it. He drove the torpedo to the surface, broke through into the air for just a moment, long enough to see the massive hull of the battleship looming beside him, close enough to throw a stone onto her deck. Then he nosed the machine down and plunged back into the depths, now inside the protected area, directly beneath the Queen Elizabeth. Bianchi, clinging to the back of the torpedo, had no idea what had just happened. He knew only that they had surfaced when they should not have, that someone on the battleship might have seen them, that alarm bells might be ringing even now. But there were no alarm bells. The British watch officers saw nothing. The two Italians reached the battleship's keel and began the agonizing process of releasing the warhead. The mechanism was designed to be operated by two men working together, one holding the torpedo steady while the other manipulated the release clamps. In practice, in absolute darkness, with hands numb from cold and minds clouded by oxygen deprivation, it became a struggle against machinery that seemed designed to defeat them. De la Penne pulled levers that would not move. Bianchi hammered on bolts that had corroded in the salt water. The torpedo drifted with the current, bumping against the battleship's hull, each impact a metallic thud that surely must be audible to the hundreds of men sleeping in their hammocks just feet away. Then Bianchi's rebreather failed. The oxygen supply cut off without warning, and suddenly he was drowning, his lungs pulling desperately at a mouthpiece that delivered nothing but the taste of rubber and chemicals. He clawed at de la Penne's shoulder, the universal signal for distress, and de la Penne knew instantly what had happened. They were beneath the largest warship in the Mediterranean fleet, surrounded by nets and guards and weapons, and one of them could no longer breathe. De la Penne made another decision. Bianchi would surface and accept capture, while de la Penne finished the mission alone. Bianchi rose through the water and broke the surface gasping, his vision blurred, his mind reeling from oxygen starvation. He found himself staring up at the cliff-like side of HMS Queen Elizabeth, her anchor chain disappearing into the water beside him. He tried to swim away, but his limbs would not respond. Within seconds, a searchlight pinned him in its beam, and voices shouted commands in English that he could not understand. A motor launch roared toward him, and strong hands hauled him from the water like a caught fish. He was captured, interrogated, given dry clothes and hot tea, and asked questions he refused to answer. The British knew something was happening, but they did not know what. Not yet. Below, de la Penne worked alone in the darkness. He wrestled the warhead free from the torpedo and let the lightened machine drift away, its motor still running, vanishing into the murk like a dying animal seeking a place to expire. Then he dragged the warhead, 660 pounds of dead weight, across the muddy bottom to a position directly beneath the battleship's magazines. His arms screamed with effort. His oxygen was almost gone, the rebreather producing less and less with each breath, his vision narrowing to a tunnel edged with sparks and shadows. He armed the timer, setting it for 6 hours, and then swam upward toward the light, toward capture, toward survival or drowning or something in between. He surfaced near the battleship's anchor chain and was immediately spotted by the same guards who had captured Valiant. They pulled him aboard the motor launch, stripped him of his diving gear, and took him to the Queen Elizabeth herself, where he was brought before the ship's captain. The British officer was courteous, professional, and utterly certain that de la Penne would talk. He explained that harbors were dangerous places for divers, that accidents happened, that cooperation would be rewarded. De la Penne said nothing. The captain's tone changed. He explained that sabotage was a serious matter, that divers caught in restricted waters could be shot as spies. De la Penne said nothing. The captain tried one final approach. He had de la Penne and Bianchi locked in a compartment deep in the battleship's hull, directly above the magazines, exactly where the warhead waited on the muddy bottom below. The two Italians sat in the locked room and watched the clock. They knew the timer's mechanism to the second. They knew that at 5:30 in the morning, the warhead would detonate with a force equivalent to 660 pounds of TNT, focused upward through the water into the battleship's unarmored bottom. They knew they were sitting at ground zero of an explosion that would shatter steel and ignite ammunition, and turn this compartment into a tomb of fire and seawater. At 5 in the morning, with 30 minutes remaining, de la Penne asked to speak to the captain again. He was brought to the bridge, and there, with the Alexandria dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, he told the British officer that a bomb was attached to the ship's hull and would explode in less than half an hour. He refused to say where. He refused to explain how. He simply recommended that the crew be evacuated immediately. The captain did not believe him. It was obviously a trick, a desperate lie told by a captured saboteur trying to create chaos. But procedures existed for such claims, and the captain followed them. He ordered a search of the ship's hull, sent divers down with lights and tools, began moving men away from the most vulnerable compartments. The search found nothing. The timer ticked toward zero. At 5:35 in the morning, the warhead detonated. The explosion occurred not with a dramatic fireball, but with a muffled crack that seemed too small to matter, a sound like a distant door slamming in an empty house. But beneath the surface, physics took over. 660 pounds of high explosive transformed into superheated gas in a fraction of a second, creating a pressure wave that radiated outward at thousands of feet per second. The water itself became a weapon, incompressible and dense, transmitting the shock wave into the battleship's hull with devastating efficiency. Steel plates designed to withstand the impact of 16-inch shells buckled and tore like wet paper. Bulkheads crumpled. Rivets sheared off and became shrapnel. The entire rear section of HMS Queen Elizabeth lifted several feet out of the water as the explosion pushed upward, and then the sea rushed in through a hole large enough to drive a truck through. The battleship did not sink dramatically. She settled slowly, her stern lowering into the water as thousands of tons of seawater poured into her engine rooms and magazines and crew compartments. Damage control teams ran through smoke-filled corridors, sealing hatches, starting pumps, fighting a battle they could not win. Within an hour, the Queen Elizabeth was resting on the harbor bottom, her decks awash, her guns pointed uselessly at the sky. She would not move under her own power for many months. The pride of the Mediterranean fleet had been neutralized by two men riding a pig through the darkness. But the Italians were not finished. Marceglia and Scirè, riding their torpedo deeper into the harbor, found HMS Valiant, the Queen Elizabeth's sister ship, another 33,000-ton monster that represented a quarter of Britain's capital ship strength in the Mediterranean. They maneuvered beneath her hull with the same agonizing care, fought the same battles against darkness and equipment failure and oxygen deprivation, and successfully planted their warhead beneath her keel. They armed the timer for the same 6-hour delay and then attempted to escape by swimming to shore, hoping to blend into the chaos of the harbor and somehow make their way to neutral territory. They were captured within minutes, exhausted and hypothermic, barely conscious. Like de la Penne, Marceglia eventually warned his captors about the bomb. Like de la Penne, he was not believed until it was too late. The Valiant's warhead detonated shortly after the Queen Elizabeth's, with similar results. The explosion tore through her hull, flooded her engine spaces, and left her sitting on the bottom of the harbor with only her superstructure above water. 2 battleships, the core of British naval power in the Mediterranean, disabled in a single night by 4 men with homemade weapons. Martellotta and Marino, their damaged torpedo barely functioning, could not reach the battleships. Instead, they found the tanker Sagana, a massive ship filled with fuel oil destined for the fleet. They attached their warhead to her hull and set the timer, then attempted their own escape. They were captured separately. Martellotta pulled from the water by a patrol boat. Marino found wandering the docks in his diving suit, too exhausted to care about concealment anymore. The Sagana exploded on schedule, her cargo of fuel oil igniting in a fireball that lit up the entire harbor and sent a column of black smoke thousands of feet into the Egyptian sky. The explosion damaged several nearby ships and set the harbor's oil storage facilities ablaze, creating chaos that persisted for days. 6 men had entered Alexandria harbor. All 6 were captured. None achieved escape, but the mission was a complete success. 2 battleships and a tanker were destroyed or severely damaged. The British Mediterranean fleet, already stretched thin by losses in other theaters, suddenly found itself without the capital ships necessary to challenge Italian control of the central Mediterranean. Convoys to Malta became more dangerous. Operations against North Africa had to be postponed. The strategic balance of the entire theater shifted, because 6 divers had been willing to ride their pigs into the darkness knowing they would not return. The British did not announce the losses. They could not afford to let the Axis know how successful the raid had been. For weeks, the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant remained at their moorings, their crews maintaining the illusion that the ships were operational, running engines that went nowhere, training guns that could not fire, launching boats and raising flags and conducting themselves as if nothing had happened. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the harbor and saw 2 battleships apparently ready for action. Italian intelligence suspected the truth, but could not confirm it. The deception held just long enough to prevent the Axis from exploiting their advantage, but the damage was real and lasting. De la Penne, Bianchi, Marceglia, Scirè, Martellotta, and Marino spent the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps, first in Egypt, then in British India, finally in Africa. They were treated well, according to the conventions that still governed warfare in those years, but they remained prisoners until the end of the war. When Italy changed sides in 1943, the men became technically allies of Britain, though they remained behind barbed wire for their own protection as much as for security. They were repatriated to Italy in 1945, returning to a country that had been devastated by war, occupation, and civil conflict. De la Penne survived to see his mission recognized as one of the most successful special operations of World War II. The British, in a gesture that honored the courage of enemies who had fought by the rules even in the darkness of a secret war, awarded him and his men military decorations after the war ended. The raid on Alexandria became a case study in naval special operations, analyzed by every major military in the world, the template for future frogmen and underwater commando units from the American Navy SEALs to the British Special Boat Service. But the men themselves rarely spoke of that night. When asked, they would describe the technical details, the navigation challenges, the equipment failures. They would not discuss the fear, the certainty of capture, the moment when each man realized he was swimming toward his own imprisonment or death and continued anyway. Perhaps that kind of courage cannot be explained in words. Perhaps it exists only in action, in the decision to descend into darkness because the mission requires it, because other men depend on it, because there is no one else to do it. On December 18, 1941, 6 Italian divers changed the course of a war. They disabled 2 of the most powerful warships afloat and demonstrated that courage and planning could overcome any defense. They knew they would be captured. They went anyway. And for that single night in the black water beneath Alexandria harbor, they were the most dangerous men in the world. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and sacrifice and the strange mathematics of war where 6 men can outweigh 60,000 tons of steel, then subscribe to this channel. Click the like button if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered. And leave a comment answering this question. If you had been one of those 6 divers, knowing you would be captured, knowing you might drown in the darkness or be shot as a spy, would you still have gone into the water that night? What kind of cause, what kind of mission would be worth that price?